Pheromones were supposed to be masked in the cutthroat world of Wall Street. Suppressants kept secrets safe. Yet when the lights went out on the 42nd floor and an exhausted junior analyst tumbled backward into the lap of Manhattan's most ruthless billionaire, every carefully built lie instantly shattered. Cold rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seagram building, blurring the glittering skyline of Midtown Manhattan into a smear of grey and neon. Inside the sleek, temperature-controlled offices of Bradford and Mitchell Financial, the atmosphere was far less forgiving than the storm outside. Ophelia gripped his ceramic coffee mug, a heavily chipped souvenir from a brief vacation in Seattle, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His reflection in the dark monitor of his Bloomberg terminal revealed a pale, exhausted face framed by disheveled soft brown hair. Dark circles bruised the delicate skin under his eyes, a testament to 80-hour work weeks and the punishing toll of pharmaceutical-grade suppressants. Wall Street was an alpha's domain. It was an unspoken rule, an unwritten law of the corporate jungle. Betas were tolerated as middle management, the worker bees who kept the cogs turning, but omegas were considered liabilities. They were viewed as fragile, emotional, and entirely unsuited for the brutal high-stakes warfare of hedge funds and corporate acquisitions. To survive, Ophelia had spent the last 4 years relying on xylotine, a powerful off-label suppressant that suppressed not only his natural scent, a soft, betraying blend of crushed vanilla and rain-soaked jasmine, but also his energy levels, his appetite, and his overall health. Mitchell, did you finish compiling the risk assessment for the TechCorp merger? Gregory's sharp, nasal voice cut through the hum of the trading floor. Gregory was a beta, but he compensated for his lack of dominant genetics with an abundance of petty cruelty. He was Ophelia's direct supervisor, a man who consistently pawned his own responsibilities onto his subordinates while claiming the credit during board meetings. Yes, Gregory Ophelia replied, his voice deliberately flat. I emailed the finalized Excel models to you 20 minutes ago. I cross-referenced the liabilities against their Q3 earnings just like you asked. You're sure the formulas aren't broken this time? Gregory sneered, adjusting his poorly fitted Tom Ford tie. Because Heston is sitting in on the pitch today. If there is a single misplaced decimal, he won't just fire me. He'll obliterate this entire floor. Just the mention of that name caused a collective shiver to ripple through the nearby cubicles. Heston Bradford, 34 years old, self-made billionaire, and an alpha of such terrifying magnitude that his mere presence in a room could force lesser men to their knees. He wasn't just a CEO, he was an apex predator in a bespoke Brioni suit. Rumors about him were the lifeblood of the firm's water cooler gossip. Some said he had orchestrated the hostile takeover of a rival firm solely because their CEO had insulted his mentor. Others whispered about the time he broke a competitor's jaw at the World Economic Forum in Davos over a breached non-disclosure agreement. Heston was intensely private, notoriously cold, and demanded absolute perfection. Ophelia had only seen him from a distance, a towering, broad-shouldered figure with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic Ocean. Even from 50 feet away, the heavy, suffocating weight of his alpha pheromones, sharp cedarwood ozone, and cold steel was enough to make Ophelia's suppressed instincts scream in submission. The formulas are perfect, Gregory Ophelia said, swallowing the lump of anxiety forming in his throat. He glanced at the digital clock on his desk. 4:15 p.m. His next dose of xylotine was due at 5 p.m. He could already feel the familiar, uncomfortable warmth building at the base of his spine, a warning sign that his biology was fighting against the chemical restraints. Good. Print 6 hard copies, bind them, and bring them to conference room A in 10 minutes, Gregory snapped, already turning away. "And for God's sake, Mitchell, fix your collar. You look like you slept in a subway station." Ophelia sighed, rubbing his aching temples. He quickly printed the massive 90-page documents, his hands trembling slightly as he wrestled with the heavy-duty binder. A dull ache throbbed in his lower abdomen. The stress of the impending TechCorp merger was triggering a hormonal spike, causing his suppressants to burn out faster than usual. He desperately needed to go to the restroom to take his pills, but the clock was ticking. Grabbing the stack of heavy files, Ophelia practically jogged toward the executive wing. The carpets here were thicker, swallowing the sound of his frantic footsteps. The air was colder, infused with the subtle, expensive sense of polished mahogany and wealth. As he approached Conference Room A, he could already feel the suffocating pressure in the air. The heavy oak doors were closed, but the sheer concentration of alpha pheromones leaking into the hallway was staggering. Ophelia paused, leaning against the cool glass of the hallway partition, gasping for a breath. His internal temperature was rising. A faint, almost imperceptible trace of vanilla leaked past his chemical barrier. Not now, he pleaded with his own body. "Please just give me an hour." He adjusted his collar, took a deep, shuddering breath, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. Tension in the boardroom was thick enough to be sliced with a scalpel. The room was vast, dominated by a massive custom-built slab of black marble that served as the conference table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, rain-swept view of Madison Avenue. At the far end of the table, shrouded in the shadows of the dim ambient lighting, sat Heston Bradford. He was entirely still, his long, powerful fingers steepled beneath his chin. He wore a charcoal suit that hugged the broad lines of his chest perfectly, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He wasn't looking at the glowing projection screen at the front of the room. His piercing, glacial gaze was locked squarely on Gregory, who was sweating profusely as he fumbled through the opening statements of the presentation. Seated along the sides of the table were the firm's senior partners, mostly older alphas, and a few high-ranking betas, all watching the presentation with predatory scrutiny. Ophelia slipped in through the back doors as quietly as possible, carrying the heavy stack of binders. He moved like a ghost, distributing the files to the partners, keeping his head bowed and his gaze firmly fixed on the polished marble. Every time he stepped near an alpha, he held his breath, terrified that they would catch the faint, sweet scent slipping through his failing suppressants. These projections, Heston's voice suddenly cut through the room. It was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a physical vibration through the floorboards. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute, terrifying authority. They are fundamentally flawed. Gregory froze the laser pointer, shaking violently in his hand. Sir, I assure you we ran the models multiple page 42, Heston commanded, not even opening the binder Ophelia had just placed in front of him. You factored in the subsidiary's debt under the old tax bracket. The legislation changed 3 weeks ago. This error overvalues TechCorp by roughly $80 million. The room plunged into a deathly silence. Gregory turned the color of old parchment. He desperately clicked his mouse, bringing up the slide, in question his eyes wide with panic. He had no idea how to fix it. He didn't even understand the legislation Heston was referencing. Ophelia, standing near the back wall, felt his stomach drop. He had warned Gregory about that exact tax change. He had written a specific memo about it, which Gregory had completely ignored, insisting that his outdated model was fine. I can adjust the parameters, Mr. Bradford. Gregory stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. My assistant Mitchell, he inputted the raw data. He must have used the legacy software. A flash of pure, indignant rage cut through Ophelia's exhaustion. He stepped forward instinctively, opening his mouth to defend himself against the blatant lie. That's not Before Ophelia could finish his sentence, the thunderstorm raging outside finally made its mark. A massive bolt of lightning struck somewhere close by, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. The Seagram building's primary power grid suffered a massive surge. With a loud pop, the boardroom plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Panic erupted instantly. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. Several senior partners cursed loudly, bumping into each other in the sudden blindness. "Stay calm, the backup generators will kick in," someone shouted over the commotion. Ophelia, disoriented by the sudden darkness and the overwhelming cocktail of aggressive, panicked alpha pheromones filling the room, took a stumbling step backward. His head was spinning. The heat in his lower abdomen flared violently, a sharp cramp that made his knees buckle. The suppressants were failing fast under the sheer stress of the environment. Someone, likely Gregory, blindly rushing away from the front of the room, collided heavily with Ophelia's shoulder. The impact knocked Ophelia completely off balance. His foot tangled in the thick, braided cord of the central conference phone lying on the floor. With a sharp gasp, he fell backward into the dark void. He braced himself for the bone-shattering impact of the marble floor. Instead, he landed squarely on something warm, something solid. Two incredibly strong, muscular thighs. A sharp, shocked hiss sounded right beside his ear. Ophelia's breath hitched. He was sitting on someone's lap. But it wasn't just anyone. The air around him was suddenly saturated with the most intense, intoxicating scent he had ever encountered. It wasn't the panicked, sour smell of the other executives. It was pure, unadulterated power, rain-soaked cedarwood ozone, and a deep, grounding musk that bypassed all of Ophelia's rational thought and struck directly at his biology. It was the CEO. He had fallen directly onto Heston Bradford's lap. Before Ophelia could even begin to scramble away, a massive, heavy hand clamped down on his hip fingers, digging possessively into his waist to keep him from falling to the floor. The grip was iron-tight, immovable, and burning hot through the thin fabric of Ophelia's trousers. At that exact moment, the backup generators roared to life. The emergency LED lights along the ceiling snapped on, bathing the room in a stark, clinical white glow. Silence, far heavier and more terrifying than before, crashed over the boardroom. Every single pair of eyes was glued to the head of the table. Ophelia was frozen, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He was perched sideways across Heston Bradford's lap, his hands awkwardly braced against the alpha's broad, tailored chest. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head to look up. Heston was staring down at him. The CEO's mask of cold corporate indifference had completely vanished. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked furiously near his ear. But it was his eyes that made Ophelia's blood run cold. They weren't stormy grey anymore. They were blown wide, the pupils dilated so far that his irises looked almost entirely black. And Heston's nose was flared, taking in a deep, slow breath right near the crook of Ophelia's neck. Ophelia realized with a sickening jolt of horror that in the heat of the moment, surrounded by the alpha's overwhelming presence, his biological dam had broken. The xylotine had completely failed. The sweet, unmistakable scent of an omega in preheat was blooming directly into the personal space of the most dangerous man in New York. Sir, Ophelia whispered, his voice trembling as he pushed against the man's chest, trying to stand up. Heston's hand didn't let go. Instead, the grip on Ophelia's waist tightened, pulling him flush against the hard, imposing body beneath him. A low, terrifying sound, a raw, instinctual growl that belonged in a forest, not a boardroom, vibrated deep within Heston's chest, rumbling through Ophelia's entire body. "Mine," the CEO whispered, a sound so quiet only Ophelia could hear it. Yet it echoed with the force of an absolute, inescapable decree. Everything in Ophelia's carefully constructed invisible life had just come violently crashing down. The emergency LED lights buzzed with a low clinical hum, casting stark shadows across the paralyzed boardroom. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared to move. The air pressure in the room had physically changed, thickening, with the suffocating, heavy crush of a dominant alpha, pushed to the absolute edge of his control. Mr. Bradford Gregory's voice squeaked a pathetic, trembling sound that broke the terrible silence. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised placatingly. "Sir, I apologize for the clumsy interruption. Mitchell is incredibly uncoordinated. I'll have security escort him out immediately so we can resume if you take another step toward us." Heston's voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it sliced through the room like a perfectly honed blade. "I will throw you through that glass." Gregory froze, all the blood draining from his face. The senior partners, seasoned Wall Street veterans who orchestrated billion-dollar buyouts without breaking a sweat, instinctively averted their eyes, baring their necks in a primal, involuntary display of submission. Heston's pheromones were completely unchecked now, flooding the enclosed space with a terrifying blend of raging winter storm and burning cedar. It was an apex predator's warning. Stay away from what is mine. Ophelia was drowning in it. His vision blurred the edges of the room, tunneling into darkness. The intense proximity to a prime alpha in a state of high arousal was completely overriding his failing suppressants. A white-hot fever spiked through his bloodstream, melting away the numbness of the xylotine. He whimpered a soft, broken sound that he instantly tried to stifle by biting his lower lip, but it was too late. Heston heard it. The CEO's glacial eyes snapped down to the trembling Omega in his lap. The feral, blown-out darkness in his pupils softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a fierce, burning protectiveness. Without a word to the stunned board members, Heston stood up. He didn't just push Ophelia off. He stood and effortlessly gathered the younger man into his arms, lifting him against his broad chest as easily as if Ophelia weighed nothing at all. Meeting adjourned, Heston stated coldly to the room at large, "My legal team will contact you regarding the restructuring of this department. Gregory, clear out your desk. You're done." "So wait, please," Gregory begged, but Heston was already moving. He carried Ophelia out the heavy oak doors, ignoring the gasps and frantic whispers that instantly erupted behind them. Ophelia buried his face into the lapel of Heston's bespoke charcoal suit, overwhelmed by a dizzying mixture of terror, humiliation, and a deeply ingrained biological relief. He was completely surrounded by the scent of ozone and wood, a protective cocoon that shielded his agonizingly sensitive nose from the harsh, sterile smells of the office. I can walk." Ophelia managed to gasp out his hands, weakly gripping the expensive wool of Heston's jacket. "Please, Mr. Bradford, everyone is looking. You don't have to save your strength." Mitchell Heston murmured, his tone shifting from boardroom tyrant to something incredibly dark and possessive. "Your body is going into shock. The suppressants are tearing your nervous system apart. Do not argue with me." They bypassed the main elevators. Heston kicked open the door to his private, biometric-secured executive lift. As the doors slid shut, sealing them inside the mahogany-paneled box, the isolation hit Ophelia like a physical blow. It was just the two of them. The elevator began its rapid descent to the subterranean parking garage. The sudden shift in gravity made Ophelia's stomach swoop. Another wave of preheat cramping tore through his lower abdomen, so sharp and violent that he arched his back with a ragged cry. "Easy," Heston commanded softly. He shifted his grip, one massive hand rubbing slow, soothing circles into the base of Ophelia's spine. The touch sent shockwaves of electricity through Ophelia's overheated system. It was intoxicating, It was terrifying. Breathe through it. We're almost to the car. The basement garage was dim and echoing. A sleek armored black Mercedes Maybach S-Class was waiting, its engine already purring. A heavily built driver in a dark suit scrambled out to open the rear door, his eyes widening in shock as he caught the overwhelming wave of conflicting scents, the aggressive protective alpha dominance, and the impossibly sweet, distressed blooming of an Omega. "Take us to the penthouse, Reynolds Heston," barked, sliding into the spacious leather-upholstered back seat with Ophelia still cradled tightly against him. "And call Dr. Arrington. Tell him I need a full Omega Care trauma kit waiting for us when we arrive. Tell him it's a xylotine overdose. Right away, sir." The partition rose instantly, sealing the back seat in private soundproof darkness. Ophelia lay practically draped across Heston's chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was burning up from the inside out. The world outside the tinted windows blurred into streaks of rain and city lights as the Maybach tore through the Manhattan streets. He felt a cool, large hand brush the sweat-dampened hair away from his forehead. "Why?" Ophelia whispered, his voice cracking. He forced his heavy eyelids open, looking up at the sharp, aristocratic jawline of the billionaire. "Why are you doing this? I'm nobody. Just a junior analyst." Heston looked down his stormy eyes, tracing the flush spreading across Ophelia's pale cheeks. His thumb gently stroked the line of Ophelia's jaw. "You've never been a nobody, Ophelia," Heston said quietly, the use of his first name sending a strange thrill through Ophelia's delirious mind. "Now close your eyes. You're safe, unable to fight the exhaustion and the overwhelming tidal wave of hormones any longer." Ophelia let his eyes drift shut, finally surrendering to the darkness. When Ophelia finally woke, it wasn't to the harsh ringing of his alarm clock or the sirens of his cramped Washington Heights apartment. It was to the sound of soft rain tapping against glass and the deep, rhythmic ticking of a Patek Philippe Grand Complication clock. He opened his eyes, blinking against the muted warm light. He was buried beneath a mountain of absurdly soft fret linens, in a bed the size of a small continent. The room was massive, decorated in minimalist tones of slate navy and dark walnut. Through the sprawling floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the emerald canopy of Central Park far below, confirming he was somewhere on Billionaire's Row. Panic flared instantly. He shot up, clutching the duvet to his chest. He was wearing an incredibly soft, oversized grey t-shirt that smelled heavily of rain and cedar. It wasn't his. Careful. The IV was just removed an hour ago. Ophelia whipped his head toward the shadows in the corner of the room. Heston Bradford was sitting in a leather armchair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid resting on his knee. He had discarded the suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt had the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint, pale scars. He looked exhausted, yet utterly formidable. Mr. Bradford Ophelia breathed instantly, trying to scramble out of the bed. I have to go. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. I don't know what happened. My medication must have—" "Sit down," Heston ordered. The command wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute weight of his alpha nature. Ophelia's knees immediately buckled, forcing him to stay seated on the edge of the mattress. Heston stood up, setting the glass aside. He crossed the expansive room with slow, deliberate strides until he was standing directly over Ophelia. He reached out his fingers, incredibly gentle, as they ghosted over the pulse point on Ophelia's neck. "Dr. Arrington pumped 3 bags of fluids into you, along with a specialized flush to clear the xylotine from your liver." Heston said, his voice dangerously low. "Do you have any idea what that poison was doing to you? You were weeks away from permanent neurological damage, Ophelia." Ophelia swallowed hard, staring at the perfectly polished floorboards. It was the only way. Wall Street doesn't hire Omegas. If they knew what I was, they would have fired me. Gregory would have ruined me. Gregory Pierce will never work in the financial sector again, Heston stated, with chilling indifference. As of this morning, FINRA has revoked his licenses, and the SEC is looking into his creative accounting practices regarding the TechCorp deal. His assets have been frozen. Ophelia's head snapped up in shock. What you destroyed him because of a ruined presentation. I destroyed him because he dared to claim credit for your brilliance, and because he dared to lay his hands on you when the lights went out. Heston snarled softly, leaning down so they were eye to eye. The feral protective darkness had returned to his gaze. And because he was the reason you were starving yourself and swallowing poison every 4 hours just to survive in my building. I don't understand, Ophelia whispered, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Why do you care? You oversee thousands of employees. You didn't even know I existed until yesterday. Heston laughed, a low, humorless sound that rumbled in his chest. Didn't know you existed. Ophelia, look at me. Ophelia met his gaze, mesmerized by the intensity burning in the stormy grey depths. 4 years ago, Heston began, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. The Waldorf Astoria. Bradford and Mitchell was hosting an alumni mixer for Ivy League graduates. I was forced to attend. I hated the crowds, the noise, the desperate networking. I stepped out onto the terrace to breathe. Ophelia's breath hitched. A forgotten memory abruptly surfaced. A cold November night. He had been a struggling graduate student, overwhelmed by the aggressive alpha posturing at the mixer. He had slipped out onto a dark balcony to hide. You were out there, Heston continued, taking a step closer until his knees bracketed Ophelia's legs. You were crying. You didn't have your suppressants perfectly balanced back then. The wind shifted, and I caught it. Crushed vanilla and rain-soaked jasmine. It was the purest, most maddening scent I had ever encountered. It bypassed every rational defense I had. I walked toward the corner, but a security guard interrupted me for an emergency phone call. By the time I turned back, you were gone. Ophelia stared at him, paralyzed by disbelief. You remember that I never stopped looking, Heston confessed fiercely, his hands coming down to grip Ophelia's shoulders. I bought out 6 boutique firms searching employee registries. I acquired Bradford and Mitchell specifically because I tracked a group of graduates from that mixer to their HR files. But I couldn't find you. Because you started taking xylotine. You erased your scent completely. You were working under my roof for 3 years, and I couldn't find you. Tears welled up in Ophelia's eyes. The sheer weight of the revelation was crushing. The most powerful man in Manhattan had ripped apart corporate structures and bought entire companies just to find a ghost on a balcony. Yesterday, when the power grid failed and the xylotine broke under the stress, Heston's thumb swept a stray tear from Ophelia's cheek. You fell into my lap, and the moment I breathed you in, 4 years of searching came to an end. You are exactly where you belong. I can't just be a kept Omega. Ophelia protested weakly, though his body was unconsciously leaning into the alpha's warmth. I worked too hard for my degree. I have a career. I love the math, the models, and you will continue to do them. Heston interrupted his expression, softening into something entirely devoted. You're not going back to a cubicle, Ophelia. You're taking the corner office next to mine. You will be the senior VP of risk assessment. You'll build the models and I will execute them. No more suppressants, no more hiding. You will walk onto that trading floor, smelling exactly as you are. And if any alpha dares to look at you with anything less than absolute respect, I will personally ruin them. Ophelia looked up into the eyes of the ruthless corporate predator, seeing only a fiercely loyal protector offering him the world on a silver platter. The fear that had dictated his life for the past 4 years began to melt away, replaced by a warm, blooming hope. He didn't have to hide anymore. He was safe. Slowly, deliberately, Ophelia lifted his trembling hands and rested them flat against Heston's chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of the Alpha's heart. He tilted his head, exposing the sensitive skin of his neck in a deep, instinctual gesture of absolute trust. Heston let out a shuddering breath, wrapping his arms around Ophelia and pulling him securely against his chest. As the storm raged on outside, the penthouse glass inside the billionaire Alpha finally held the one asset he valued above all else. Everything had changed forever, and neither of them would ever let go. If you loved this intense, heart-stopping, Omegaverse corporate romance, smash that like button and share it with your friends who crave drama and billionaires. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our steamy, dramatic audio stories. Leave a comment below telling us what you thought of Heston's ultimate alpha move, and we'll see you in the next video.